Welcome and thanks for joining us on the latest edition of The Front Page. I'm your host Tom Kerr, and coming up on today's show we have all the latest big racing stories, including the latest developments in the John Dance investigation, the news and reaction to Constitution Hill staying over hurdles, the Gambling Commission publishes an open letter to Racing Post readers. We take a look at its contents and what it means. And finally, we'll be looking ahead to the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe on Sunday at Longchamp, the crowning glory of the European flat season. For all of that, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Front Page regular John Harding. That's your official title now in this show.
I'll take that. Morning, Tom.
Excellent. And dialing in from deepest countryside of Britain, Deputy Industry Editor Peter Scargill. How are you, Pete?
I'm all right, mate. Yeah, I've hacked away some of the foliage around here so I can get a better signal for today, so I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, pleasure to have you. We are going to get started with John Dance, the latest development in this long-running story. Regular readers, regular viewers of the show will know that John Dance earlier this year had his horses suspended from racing after the FCA, the city regulator, announced it was shutting down his financial services company after discovering serious regulatory issues. Subsequent to that, the BHA came to an agreement with the FCA that the horses could run under different colours and under different names, that any proceeds from them running would be frozen. But last week, the BHA announced that due to new allegations coming to light, they had once again suspended John Dance's horses. John, this is a long-running and pretty murky saga, but give us the lowdown of the latest developments.
Yeah, of course. So the latest developments last week are sort of separate to the FCA investigation. So on Monday, the BHA essentially prohibited runners in the colours of Titanium Racing, which is a racing club backed by Dance, and Coverdale Stud, which is his sort of racing interests, not in his own name, but under the banner of Coverdale Stud. These horses were allowed to run primarily for James Horton, his private trainer, who we'll get onto. So from Monday, those horses weren't permitted to run. That's over an alleged non-payment of fees to Titanium members, or members of this racing club, relative to the sale of a horse called Sacred Angel. And Pete did a lot of the reporting on this. It's understood that that's the situation there over alleged non-payments. That then developed again with James Horton, who had been private trainer to John Dance, training horses in those Coverdale Stud colours primarily. Obviously no longer has any horses to run because they're unable to run from a BHA directive. So he announced that he'll be moving to Newmarket at the end of the season and essentially cutting ties with Dance and Coverdale Stud. So we're sort of moving now onto the human cost of this situation and those that are impacted, as opposed to the investigation. But there's a lot to come out now about what the sort of basis of these alleged non-payments are.
Yeah, so let's start with James Horton, of course, private trainer to Dance. So as you say, he's announced he's cutting ties. I mean, he's obviously, as a private trainer to Dance, it was inevitable that he was going to get caught up and be affected by this. At the same time, he sort of is, I guess, the most visible face of the sort of racing people who have been caught up in this through effectively no fault of their own, and discovered that they're unable to continue racing horses, or they're unable to bring in any money. You know, if you look at the spread of people affected by this, even within racing alone, it's quite significant.
No, absolutely, and it's impossible not to have sympathy for him, because when he took that role as private trainer to John Dance, we're talking about a winner of Grade 1s, Group 1s, a major sponsor, a fairly prominent owner in racing, and one that engaged with the media, one that was quite visible as well. You know, this was a fairly exciting opportunity for him, and for it to go, you know, he couldn't have predicted that it would go south quite as drastically as it has. And he's been in a very difficult situation, obviously being approached for all sorts of comment on investigations and this, that and the other, and he's handled himself, I think, very well during that time. But this latest development essentially means he's unable to run any horses, so his hands have been completely tied. And I think he will have, with that move, I think he'll have a lot of support from owners who understand that this is a very promising young trainer, very talented trainer, who just simply hasn't had the breaks so far. So hopefully a new chapter for him. And also members of the racing club, for instance, members of staff involved with these horses. It's far wider than just one individual that's involved in the FCA case and indeed with this latest BHA concerns. So a developing story, certainly. I think it's going to rumble on a little bit longer now.
And what's the latest on the FCA probe into dance?
I think we're largely, unless sort of Pete might have an idea, but I think we're largely as we were. Certainly a few things have come to light in the mainstream media. There was a piece in the Times not long ago with some former employees at WealthTech suggesting that their concerns weren't listened to by the city regulator. But beyond that, it's just drips and drabs while that investigation continues.
Pete, you've obviously been reporting on this story for some time. What can you add to the summary John just provided there?
That's a pretty comprehensive summary, really. The statement from the BHA last Monday was very sort of vague in terms of what was going on. So we obviously managed to unpick a little bit more of it. It's just a mess. It's a completely predictable mess, in my opinion. I don't know quite why we let it get this far into the season.
Pete, you're referring to the decision to allow the horses to race there when you say it's a mess.
I think the whole situation around the John Dance horses this season, even going back to Brave Man's game at the start of the year, and he was in and then he was out, and then there was a sale rush through so he could run in Ireland. It seems, I don't know, we've gone up above and beyond to try and facilitate these horses running, which is in the end caused troubles down the line. Where, look, I wrote about it earlier in the year. I completely understand money being put towards the horses being cared for and the staff being paid, as we've quite rightly pointed out. These people are drawn into this and involved in it through no fault of their own. But I don't know, it almost feels inevitable that something would go wrong as a result of this, or allegedly go wrong as a result of this. Because I don't know, I just don't see why these horses have been running, really.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Pete, and thank you, John. As you say, a huge story which is going to continue to rumble and will eventually come to a head, presumably when charges are officially brought, if they are brought. We'll obviously have all the details when that does happen, so do stay tuned. We're going to move on to our second story, which is that Constitution Hill, in the most unsurprising news of the summer, will stay over hurdles. But for all that was completely unsurprising, it did cause quite a lot of controversy, particularly on social media, where people were up in arms, at least temporarily, at being denied the chance to see Constitution Hill go over fences and potentially one day tackle the Gold Cup. Pete, was Nicky Henderson right to make the decision to stay over hurdles?
In the end, he was right to make the decision because they feel that's the best thing for the horse. I know that's quite a naff answer, but you know what I mean. If that's what they feel is the best for their horse and what they can get the best results from, then it's the right thing to do. It caused a bit of a storm, a bit of an understandable reaction, and to some extent that was brought on by themselves. Particularly Michael Buckley, the owner, likes to sort of freewheel a bit in his statements about, wouldn't it be great if a horse did this, emulate Dawn Run, or wouldn't it be great if he went and took on these horses? And people latch onto that sort of thing because in the end, don't get to see big clashes too often. So the idea of seeing another Dawn Run was tempting, wasn't it? But in the end, not many champion hurdle horses go chasing. From my research this morning, I can see only 3 that have gone chasing this century, which is Ola Loire, Fahine, and Rock on Ruby. So in the end, most champion hurdle horses stay over hurdles. He's a brilliant horse, brilliantly fast horse. I'm not the biggest jump aficionado by any stretch of the imagination, but watching him is exhilarating. So look, it's going to be exciting wherever we see him. And look, I don't know whether you guys feel different, but in the end, he's going to be a special horse for everyone to watch this season. So I understand the reasons why people were annoyed, but in the end, he's going to be brilliant. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's worth highlighting. David Jennings did a great column on Saturday where he spoke to 9 top trainers. Just one on the record. Paul Nicholls happy to give his view. Others slightly more circumspect, but they all said the exact same thing, which is that they would have made the same decision. Paul Nicholls said, what would I do? I would stay over hurdles and win the next 3 champion hurdles. I honestly would not have entertained going chasing to him. So Nicky Henderson, by no means an outlier or being unduly conservative comparatively to his peers. But I guess we can see why people are frustrated, can't we, John?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm one of the people that quite enjoyed this little soap opera in the summer of will he, won't he. It adds a little layer of intrigue for me. I understand what people are saying. They don't want to see Constitution Hill, this highly exciting, probably the most exciting horse in jumps racing, turning up at very skimpy odds and just obliterating horses over hurdles. But there's so many hypotheticals here, and I think it slightly underestimates the challenge of winning a champion hurdle. This idea that he's just going to go and win the next 3.
He is no bigger than 1 to 2 for next year's champion hurdle.
Yeah.
Definitely testament to what a superstar he is. But imagine he was going for the champion chase. He certainly wouldn't be 1 to 2. No. I guess that's what people are saying. It's a perfectly logical decision by connections, but if you want to see competitive racing and you want to see challenges, then it's obviously not going to lean into that. It's going to provide something quite different, which is displays of, we expect, dominance, and something freakishly wrong would have to happen for him to be beaten.
And I think you're right, and people do want to see competitive racing, but the idea that falls squarely on the shoulders of Nicky Henderson to run his best horse over what he believes is, or in what he believes is the wrong discipline for that horse, over a trip that he doesn't think is right for the horse, when he can run in very good races and win a lot of prize money, which is the sole purpose of a trainer's job. It's not on him to fix British racing's competitiveness issues. It's on every other trainer to try and find the horses that can go and take on Constitution Hill and serve it up to him. Maybe there's one lurking out there that we don't know about.
Sorry, John, I was just going to say, not to think that if Constitution Hill had gone novice chasing this year, he'd be running in highly competitive races anyway. He'd be dawdling around at 1 to 7, probably, and it wouldn't be till he got to Cheltenham where there was some sort of element of competitiveness anyway. We know the novice chasers at Cheltenham aren't exactly filled to the brim with horses. They're normally filled to the brim with Willie Mullins trained horses. So I don't know. It's not the idea that he's going down the cheaper route by going hurdling doesn't make sense in the long run. If he was running in Gold Cups or Champion Chases, I understand that. But I don't know. It's not like this season's going to be any less competitive because he's staying in the Champion Hurdle division than if he was going novice chasing.
Uncompetitive racing, whatever happens. Pete Scargill's verdict on the big topic. Pete, just finally, do you see anyone in that Champion Hurdle division that could give him a scare?
Now, I'm notoriously shrewd when it comes to punting, and particularly anti-post punting. So when Cheltenham finished last year, I said to my wife, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back Constitution Hill for the Arkle, and I'm going to back Imperial Pass for the Champion Hurdle, because they'll definitely go chasing with Constitution Hill, and Imperial Pass is the horse to take up the mantle. So I was sort of right in one sense, in the sense that Imperial Pass is going to go over hurdles, and I think he's a pretty exciting horse, to put it mildly. So that could be a big clash, but we're not going to know that until Cheltenham, are we? That's going to be when those two come together. But I think Willie Mullins sort of committing to 2 of his big horses staying over hurdles for this year, obviously winning the Melbourne Cup with Vauban as well, busy man, that's really going to spice things up.
And on that staggering piece of anti-post betting, triumphant activity, we will wrap up that story. We're going to move on to our next story imminently, but first of all, our Members Club Ultimate, that's our top digital subscription special summer deal, is coming to a close on Friday. You get it for $9.99 for the first 2 months. Contains loads of fantastic stuff. Pete Scargill does not do anti-post tipping in Members Club Ultimate, you'll be glad to hear, but he does contribute to our superb in-depth news coverage, as does John, and then you get tipping advice from the likes of Tom Kerr, Paul Keeley, and lots more besides. Take a look at this ad and we'll be back in a second.
Are you ready to take your passion for horse racing to the next level? With Racing Post Members Club, you gain exclusive access to the best racing insights, analysis and tools. Immerse yourself in award-winning content from interviews with the sport's biggest stars to race previews and behind-the-scenes features. Get the inside track with early access to the Racing Post digital newspaper from 9 p.m. in the evening and daily selections from our expert tipsters. Racing Post Members Club is your ultimate ticket to the thrilling world of racing. Subscribe today and pay just £9.99 per month for the first 2 months with the code SUMMER. See the link in the video description for more information. Terms apply.
Welcome back. On to our next story, and we're going to look at the Gambling Commission and the open letter that they penned to Racing Post readers. This was published on their website last week and set out to correct what they said were a series of misunderstandings about the consultation it's currently running into affordability checks. The open letter was accompanied by some pretty disparaging comments about our coverage, suggesting it was imbalanced and effectively blaming the Racing Post for propagating these misunderstandings. And so inevitably for a few days the story became Gambling Commission attacks the Racing Post. But frankly, what the Commission thinks about the Racing Post does not matter one jot. As I explained in response, what matters is what matters to our readers. And that is that affordability checks are already happening, that they are having a hugely detrimental impact on many people's ability to follow their pastime and to have a bet, that it's having a very significant knock-on impact for the sport of racing, and that the proposals outlined by the Gambling Commission for the future shape of affordability checks do not seem to align with the government's proposals and threaten to make an already bad situation worse. However, I think it is worth looking at this open letter because there are some points in it which obviously are hugely important that Andrew Rhodes, the Chief Executive of the Gambling Commission, made because he wanted to reassure Racing Post readers. And I think it's worth analysing these because ultimately they do go to the core, John, of whether affordability checks are something that people should be concerned about or indeed something that really is going to work out just fine, which is effectively Andrew Rhodes' position. So I think there were two key messages that Andrew Rhodes was trying to get across. The first related to the scale of affordability checks, and he basically said, readers could easily assume, based on the volume and nature of the coverage, that under the proposals, a good proportion of gambling consumers would have to be handing over payslips or bank statements when they want to place a bet. This is not true. And Andrew Rhodes points to the fact that the Gambling Commission's estimate is that just 3% of accounts would have to undergo financial risk assessments, which of course are going to be triggered when people spend a certain amount of money on their betting, either £1,000 in 24 hours or £2,000 in 90 days. Now, this is the first sort of problematic fact from me, because basically, my view, and I think Racing Post readers understand this intuitively, is that sort of saying that 3% of all accounts will meet these triggers and then trying to apply that to Racing Post readers is kind of like sort of saying to someone who drinks fine wines that if there was a limit on the amount of money you could spend on wine, it would only affect 3% of consumers and thus not to worry, when of course someone who's spending a significant amount of time and indeed money on a pastime or hobby is obviously not the average consumer.
Yes. And that's exactly the point, isn't it? And this 3% seems to factor in all active accounts during a year. So that's once a year punters, that's infrequent punters. And as we know from the reams and reams of correspondence that we've had from readers, these aren't average punters in that sense. They're not once a year punters. These are people who are fairly regular, who follow the sport, who like to have a bet, as is their right, just as it's their right to go and buy a drink in the pub or do any number of other things that don't have these sorts of limitations being imposed. So it's the idea that 3%'s is from a different sample, really. If you were to sample Racing Post readers and punters, I believe that figure would be a lot higher.
And we, of course, we did a major survey earlier the year, the Big Punting Survey, and over 9,000 British respondents to it, and 16.6% of them said that they'd already had an affordability check. Now, these are affordability checks under the old system where there's no clearly defined thresholds, but the generally assumed policy is that for at least quite a lot of the operators out there, the thresholds currently are higher than they would be under the Gambling Commission's proposals, and therefore if 1 in 6 have already had an affordability check under existing proposals, then it is logical to assume that there will be a similar, if not higher, proportion who will be affected by the Gambling Commission's proposal. So, I just think this is a really important element, because the Gambling Commission wants to reassure racing and racing punters that these are only going to affect a small number of people, but both racing customers and racing itself knows that this is not the case at all, and that for the sort of people who engage with the sport on a daily basis, who follow the sport, who enjoy the puzzle, who enjoy betting, the proportion who are going to end up getting caught up in the net is very high, or not very high, that's too strong a word, but is much significantly higher than the Gambling Commission's 3% estimate.
And this has been flagged, hasn't it? And that's why I find it quite disingenuous to just point to misunderstandings and everything's going to be fine and don't worry about it, without actually explaining why everything's going to be fine and where these misunderstandings or perceived misunderstandings lie.
Yeah.
The case has been put to the Gambling Commission that this is going to disproportionately impact regular punters, such as Racing Post readers.
Exactly, and this point has been made ad infinitum in the pages of the Racing Post, and Rhodes simply does not engage with it. He just repeats only 3%, but of course that includes once-a-year punters, etc. Then the second point that he sort of tries to use, he states as an attempt to reassure our readers, is that the checks will be frictionless, and that this is a huge point of contention, because in the white paper they basically set out this idea that where checks do take place, they should be, whenever possible, frictionless. People won't know that they're happening, they'll happen in the background, and people certainly won't have to hand over financial documents like pay slips and P60s as they do at present. The Minister, Stuart Andrew, has gone even further. He said that the check should be completely frictionless. He wrote this in the Racing Post. Ministers have repeated it on other occasions, including Lucy Fraser in the House of Commons. They've made it very clear that checks should be completely frictionless. But this has been a huge point of contention, because the proposals put forward in the consultation, first of all, they're quite clearly not frictionless for everyone. There's an acceptance and admission that where the frictionless approach doesn't work, people will still have to hand over documents, so it doesn't align with what the ministers have promised in that sense. But also there's a big sort of question mark over the way that the Gambling Commission sets out that checks should work, frictionless checks should work, basically involving using a credit reference check to ascertain people's ability to afford their gambling. And we've raised in our coverage, and many people who are within the industry and experts have sort of raised concerns about the viability of this, the technical viability of it. And really, the simple response from Andrew Rhodes is, it'll be fine.
Oh, good.
Yeah. There's no real explanation of how these checks work, and that's what we keep saying to the Gambling Commission. Show us the mechanics. Get the credit reference agencies to state that this will work, this can work, and it's not going to have an impact on people's credit rating. Because right now, you basically just got to take the Gambling Commission's word for it.
Yeah, it's completely up in the air, and I've had a number of conversations with people who have essentially said the technology just doesn't exist for this. It is starting from scratch, and the proposals are sort of blank lines that the Gambling Commission has had to colour in with these proposals. It's had to try and go from what the government has put forward in its white paper to how it's going to be carried out going forward. That's not an easy job, but at the same time, there needs to be that level of transparency. as to and clear definitions about what do we mean by frictionless. I know we can get into debates about semantics, but it's hugely, hugely important that the government's view and the Gambling Commission's view of what frictionless means totally tallies, because even if it's a tiny percentage of people that are required to hand over documents, that to me means they're not frictionless checks.
Yeah, agreed. And Pete, the impact of all of this is not just in the huge frustration it's causing racing punters and anyone who gets caught up in this. That's obviously the most tangible impact, and there's vast anger, deep pervasive anger among our readers about the impact. But the impact on racing as well, seems to be almost forgotten in some of this debate. But it could. I mean, the sport is looking down the barrel of a gun right now because its funding is so tied up with betting, and if these proposals aren't right, the damage it could do to racing is actually extremely frightening.
Again, a point that's been raised in our reporting. It's something that we've tried to flag up in what we've done, in particular the work of our industry editor Bill Barber. But the response in the select committee hearing from Andrew Rhodes almost fits in with this pattern of the letter. So he was asked directly about the impact of the proposals on racing, and he said, well, that's sort of for the department to sort out, as in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So, a lot of stuff just seems to be, trust me, we'll figure it out, everything will be fine. And that's why we have kept at this throughout the last number of months, because issues remain unresolved, facts remain unclear, details are non-existent in a lot of places. So, we've been persistent with the coverage because we haven't had any answers, and people want to know what's going on. I mean, I've never seen the volume of correspondence that we've had on this. I've been at the Racing Post for a long time now. The only other case that I could think of that generated any level of coverage towards this was the Bryony Frost Robbie Dunn case. But we get emails and letters literally every day on this matter. So we have to persist, and we have to keep asking the questions, and the impact on racing is one of these. And people within the profession are raising up, and obviously now there's this BHA-led consultation questionnaire that's going on at the moment to try and put some views across again, because this is going to have a real life impact on people operating in the sport if it's wrong. And I don't know, at the moment I'm a bit concerned about how it's going. I don't know about you guys, but it's not filling me to the brim with confidence at the moment.
No, completely agree, Pete. And we'll put a link to that BHA survey in the description, because that was launched at the back end of last week. BHA, which will be rating the sport's official response or overall response to the Gambling Commission's consultation, have put together a survey which closely mirrors the questions in the Gambling Commission's consultation, and are seeking to use this survey to gather the views of racing punters, which will then provide a quantitative aspect to their response, illustrating the strength of feeling among racing customers. So we'll put a link to that in the description, and please do fill it out if you get a few spare minutes. We'll leave that story there. Quite enough Gambling Commission and consultation for 1 week, especially a week like this week, which ends in Paris at Longchamp for the biggest race of the European flat season. It's the Arc, of course. It's actually a little slightly funny shape to the Arc this year. It's, dare I say, not necessarily looking like a vintage edition on the surface?
Possibly. I think it's certainly more open than it has appeared in previous years. Enable didn't help with that, obviously, going into a very warm favourite a few times. I have the rare distinction of having been 3 times, and I've yet to see a British or Irish winner, which is quite, so don't worry, I'm not going this year, so it might have a British and Irish winner. Yeah, possibly a bit open. Obviously with the ground, goodness only knows, because 1 minute there's a deluge in Paris, and the next it's dry, but it looks as though we're not going to be running on quite the attritional stuff that we have in previous years. It does look very open. Ace Impact is the sort of talking horse, if you will. The French 3-year-old looks incredibly good, but I think the older horses would be where I'm looking. The likes of Huckham and Westover, I think, have to have a very good chance.
Yeah, Huckham would be a huge winner for Owen Burrows as well. A very good interview with Owen in Sunday's paper by Lewis Porteous. He's a, for a sort of a trainer who's, he's obviously had some big successes, particularly with Huckham, but it would be such a huge step forward, and it sort of speaks to an interesting lineup for this year's race, that some of the bigger yards, some of the biggest yards, the ones you'd normally expect to have runners towards the head of that market, aren't necessarily going there with headline chances, and perhaps it is one for a slightly smaller operation this year.
I think you're right. I think it might be. I mean, Frankie Dettori's riding free wind for John and Thady Gosden, so no disrespect, but that's largely circumstantial. With Emily Upjohn, looks like she's going Breeders' Cup instead as her main target, but you'd expect the Gosdens to have one at a slightly shorter price than that. Continuous is still in there, I believe, fairly short price for Aidan.
Looking like the only
Aidan O'Brien representative, which is crazy when you think about it. You'd envisage him having a whole team going. So yeah, it could be a year for one of those smaller yards.
Yeah. Pete, how do you see it shaping up? And are you heading over to Paris?
No trip to Paris for me this year. I haven't been since Daydream won many years ago. I don't even know when that was now. That's how old I am. I can't remember trips out anymore. It's a fascinating race. Ace Impact be a superstar, doesn't he? He's the one in the race that could be the stratospheric horse for the future. And obviously, it might be quite nice for Jean-Claude Rouget after last year with Badani being beaten and him bursting into tears in the aftermath of Alpinista winning for Sir Mark Prescott. So,
tears of happiness, we should say, Pete. You make it sound like he's sobbing about coming second, but he was absolutely thrilled for his old friend Sir Mark Prescott to get his win in the Arc. It was a beautiful scene, actually.
Of course, yes. He wasn't sobbing on the edge of the paddock, thinking, "Oh no, Prescott's won the race." Yes, it was very much a happy tears situation. John, I'm thinking the older horses are the interesting one. I mean, the fact that you mentioned Continuous being the only horse from Ballydoyle is quite remarkable. But some of the horses at bigger prices, and as we've already known, my punting prowess is well established. I quite like Simfamil, that won the race in Germany, the Arc race in Germany last time out, that was won by Alpinista and Toccata Tasso. So there you are, Simfamil. I suspect a price crash on this horse the moment this podcast goes out.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Pete. For what it's worth, I like Huckham, but who is tuning in to the front page for tipping advice? If you are, what are you doing? There's other shows on this channel which are much better than this, and they'll be on later this week, so stay tuned. We're going to wrap it up there. Just finally, before we come to the conclusion where we pick what goes on the front page, if you are looking to have a bet at Longchamp this week, you might want to check out our free bets page. Here's an ad. Okay, welcome back. So it only remains for me to decide what goes on the front page this week. Normally this is a sort of a dictatorial thing, John, but what do you think? What do you think?
Oh, wow, good. Well, my story, naturally.
There we go. Okay, job done. Which one was that one again?
No, I think given the ongoing significance, given the developments of last week, I think the Gambling Commission is probably still the biggest story in town.
Regrettably so.
Yes,
we dearly wish that we would never have to mention the words Gambling Commission or affordability checks on this show ever again. But I fear we would not be doing you, our viewers and readers, any justice whatsoever if we didn't continue to pursue this important story. But we will leave that there for this week. We move on to better and more interesting things later this week, as the Arc Hoves interview. We'll have lots of great coverage on racingpost.com, in the newspaper, and on this YouTube channel. So please do stay tuned and join us again next Monday when we'll chew over all the week's news, including what happened in Paris. Thanks again.